I watched the video 3 times before I believed what I was seeing. Not because the footage was unclear, it was sharp, well-lit, professionally edited, exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd been shooting anniversary films for 15 years. I watched it 3 times because my brain kept insisting there was another explanation, that I was misreading the frame, that the woman I'd built my entire adult life with was not the person I was looking at on that screen. But she was, and I knew it by the 3rd viewing, when I finally stopped hoping I was wrong. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, the daughter of a high school history teacher and a woman who made the best peach cobbler in 3 counties and never once let me forget it. I joined the Army at 22, not because I had something to prove, but because I genuinely believed in the idea of service, of contributing something real to something larger than yourself. My grandfather had served in Korea. My uncle did 2 tours in Desert Storm. Service wasn't a concept in our family. It was just what you did when your country needed you. I spent 6 years as a logistics officer, 2 of them stationed at Fort Campbell, 1 in South Korea, 1 rotation through Kuwait that I don't talk about much. When I came home for the last time, I was 28. I had a storage unit full of things I'd shipped back in pieces, a dog named Sergeant that my mother had been keeping for me, and a very clear sense of exactly 2 things I wanted: a quiet life and a good marriage. I found both. Or I thought I did. My husband, I'll call him Daniel, was someone I'd known since college. We'd stayed friends through my deployments, through his graduate program, through the kind of long-distance closeness that's built on late-night calls and letters that take 2 weeks to arrive. When I came home for good, things between us became something different. Something I hadn't expected but recognized immediately. The way you recognize a song you haven't heard in years. We got engaged 8 months later, married the following spring in a small ceremony outside Asheville, in the backyard of my mother's house, under a string of lights my father had spent 3 weekends getting exactly right. It was a beautiful day. I remember every part of it. What I didn't know, standing there in my grandmother's rearranged pearls while my father tried not to cry and my best friend from Fort Campbell squeezed my hand too hard, was that someone else in that yard also knew Daniel in ways I didn't. I wouldn't find that out until 14 months later. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a stack of paperwork from the Veterans Resource Center where I'd started volunteering after my discharge. The number was local but unfamiliar. I almost didn't pick up. Claire? The voice was a man's, careful, like someone choosing each word individually before releasing it. "This is Marcus Webb. I filmed your anniversary video last month." I remembered him. Quiet, professional, arrived exactly on time, set up his equipment without making a fuss. Daniel had found him through someone at his office. Marcus had spent an afternoon with us at the Botanical Gardens, and then another hour at the restaurant where we'd had our first real date, 7 years ago. "Of course," I said. "We loved the video, Marcus. I told Daniel we should write you a proper review." There was a pause. "I appreciate that," he said. "But that's not why I'm calling." Another pause. Longer this time. "I need you to come to my studio. There's something in the footage I think you need to see." And I'd prefer he stopped, seemed to reconsider how to finish the sentence. "I'd prefer you came alone. Don't mention to Daniel that we spoke." I didn't ask him to explain on the phone. I don't know why. Maybe it was the steadiness in his voice, that particular kind of calm that people use when they're delivering news they've already made their peace with. I'd heard it from commanders, from chaplains, from doctors in waiting rooms. I said I'd be there by noon. The drive to Marcus's studio took 20 minutes. I spent most of it telling myself reasonable things, that he'd found a technical issue with the file, that one of the backup drives had corrupted, and he needed a release for something, that there was a perfectly ordinary explanation for why a videographer needed to speak to a client alone and urgently, without her husband knowing. I was still telling myself those things when I sat down across from him at a small table in his editing suite, and he turned the monitor toward me. "I want you to watch a specific section," he said. About 43 minutes in, I was doing a final pass on the color grading when I noticed it. I almost missed it. He pressed play. On screen, Daniel and I were sitting at the corner table at Rosario's, the restaurant where we'd had our first date. I was laughing at something. I looked happy, genuinely, easily happy in the way that doesn't perform itself. The camera was at a slight angle to catch the window light, and in the lower left corner of the frame, Daniel's phone was face up on the table. Marcus paused the footage and zoomed. The screen on Daniel's phone was lit. A message preview was visible along the top. The sender's name was saved as a contact. The first 3 words of the message were readable before the preview cut off. Can't stop thinking. The contact name was a woman's name. Not a colleague's name. Not a name I recognized from any story Daniel had ever told me. Marcus let me sit with it. He didn't say anything. He'd printed out a screenshot, and he slid it across the table without explanation. I picked it up and looked at it for a long time. The way you look at something when your eyes are working but your understanding is running about 30 seconds behind. How long have you had this? I asked. Since the rough cut, he said. 3 weeks ago. I went back and forth about what to do. I almost didn't call. He folded his hands on the table. But I have a daughter. She's 26, and I kept asking myself what I'd want someone to do, if it were her. I nodded. I wasn't sure what I said after that. Something polite, probably. Something that didn't match what was happening behind my face. I drove home on roads I didn't see. Sergeant met me at the door, tail going, completely unaware that the floor had just dropped out of the world. I sat on the couch without taking off my coat for a very long time. That night, I didn't say anything to Daniel. We had dinner. He told me about a meeting at work. I asked follow-up questions in the right places. I washed the dishes. I went to bed. I lay there in the dark and thought about everything I knew for certain. That Marcus had no reason to lie. That the image I'd seen was real. That the name on that phone was not a name I'd ever heard. And that I was not, under any circumstances, going to fall apart before I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. I want to be clear about something. I'm not naturally a cold person. My mother will tell you I cried at a Ford truck commercial when I was 30 years old and felt no embarrassment about it. My soldiers used to say I was the most direct person they'd ever met, which in the army is a kind of compliment, and which mostly meant that I said what I thought and meant what I promised. What I am, under pressure, is methodical. The army gave me that. Or maybe it just sharpened what was already there. When something goes wrong in a high-stakes environment, you don't spiral. You assess. You gather information. You make a plan. So that's what I did. Over the next 11 days, I gathered information. I'm not going to detail every step because some of it is still too raw and some of it is private in ways I want to protect. What I'll say is this. By the end of those 11 days, I knew the name. I knew the duration 14 months, which meant it had started 4 months before our first anniversary. And I knew, from a conversation I was not supposed to overhear, conducted quietly in the driveway while Daniel thought I was asleep, that it had not stopped. 14 months. That number sat in my chest like something that needed to be removed surgically. I called my mother on a Thursday evening, after Daniel had left for what he said was a work dinner. I sat on the back porch with Sergeant's head in my lap, and I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then she said, "Claire, listen to me. What he did is not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of his character. And those are 2 completely different things, even when it doesn't feel that way." I didn't cry right then. I cried later, after we hung up, in the dark on the back porch, with my hand in my dog's fur and the sound of the neighbor's wind chime coming over the fence. I cried the way you cry when something you thought was permanent turns out to be conditional. When something you built carefully over years turns out to have been built on a foundation that only one of you knew was cracked. I cried for about 20 minutes. Then I washed my face and went inside and started making a list. My best friend from Fort Campbell, a woman named Priya who now lived in Nashville and had known me since we were both 23 and terrified and pretending we weren't, drove up the following Saturday without being asked. She showed up on my doorstep at 10 in the morning with a bag from my favorite bakery and the specific expression on her face that means she's prepared to be angry on your behalf for as long as necessary. We sat at my kitchen table for 6 hours. She listened. She asked the right questions. She did not tell me what to do, which is the exact quality in a friend that matters most when everything else is uncertain. "What do you want?" she asked at one point. Not what was fair, not what he deserved. What did I want? I had to think about it for a long time before I answered. "I want to stop feeling like I miscalculated something fundamental," I said. "I want the version of this where I don't spend the next 5 years angry." She nodded. "Okay. So what does that version look like?" There are things I won't share publicly about what came next, because some of it belongs only to the people who were in it. What I will say is that I did not make any decision in anger, that I had several conversations that were among the hardest of my life, that Daniel said things during those conversations that told me, more clearly than anything else could have, exactly who he had become and how differently we now understood the word commitment. We separated in November. I stayed in the house through the winter, because Sargent needed the yard and because I needed the familiarity of those four walls, while I rebuilt something inside myself that I didn't quite have a name for yet. The Veterans Resource Center where I'd been volunteering became, during those months, one of the most important places in my life. It sounds like a small thing when I say it that way, but it wasn't. Twice a week, I sat at a folding table in a room with fluorescent lights, and I helped veterans navigate the bureaucratic machinery of the VA system benefit claims, housing resources, employment training. I was not trained as a counselor. I was just someone who understood the language and had the patience to sit with people while they figured out the next step. What I got back was something I hadn't realized I'd been missing since I left the service. A sense of usefulness that wasn't conditional on anyone's approval. A reminder that the part of me that had chosen service was still intact, even when other parts felt shattered. There was a man who came in every Thursday, a Vietnam veteran named Edward, who walked with a cane and told the same two jokes every single week without variation or apology. He'd been waiting on a benefits decision for 8 months, lost in the system in ways that were maddening and inexplicable and completely routine for anyone who'd dealt with it before. I spent 6 weeks on his case. Phone calls, appeals, letters to 2 different congressional offices. When the decision finally came through and I called to tell him, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Young lady, I have been waiting to hear that for longer than you've been an adult." I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward, and I laughed until I cried, and I couldn't entirely have explained which feeling was which. That winter was hard. I won't pretend it wasn't. There were evenings when the house felt enormous in all the wrong ways, and mornings when the first thought I had upon waking was one I had to actively choose not to follow. I leaned on my mother more than I had since I was a child. I let Priya call me every night for 2 months, even on the nights I didn't have much to say. I ran in the mornings, long routes through neighborhoods I didn't know, because movement helped. And because there's something about early morning in a quiet neighborhood, the specific quality of light before the day has fully committed to itself, that made things feel temporarily manageable. I want to tell you something about Marcus, the videographer, because I think his part in this matters more than it might seem. After everything settled, after the paperwork and the difficult conversations and the long stretch of winter that eventually became spring, I went back to his studio. I brought him a thank you card and a gift card to a restaurant near his office, which felt inadequate, because what do you bring someone who gave you information that changed your life? But I brought it, because not bringing it felt worse. He seemed surprised to see me. He asked how I was doing in the careful way of someone who wasn't sure how much he was allowed to know. I told him I was doing better, that it had been hard but that I was grateful, that what he'd done had taken a kind of courage that I didn't take for granted. He shook his head a little. "I almost didn't call," he said again. "I talked to my wife about it. She said, 'If it were our daughter, what would you want?'" He looked at me. That was the end of the conversation. I thought about that on the drive home. About how the right thing to do is often the uncomfortable thing. About how integrity is mostly demonstrated in the small decisions, the ones where no one would necessarily know if you'd chosen differently, where the easier path is so close you can practically step onto it without trying. Marcus had chosen the harder path. My mother had known exactly what to say. Priya had driven 3 hours without being asked. Edward, on a Thursday in November, had laughed at his own joke while I helped him with his paperwork and reminded me, without knowing he was doing it, what it felt like to contribute something real. I'm not the same person I was 2 springs ago, standing in my mother's backyard under those string lights. Some of that is loss, and some of it is something harder to name, a kind of density. Maybe, a solidity that comes from having been through something difficult and having chosen, at each decision point, not to let it make you smaller. I still volunteer at the resource center twice a week. I've taken on more cases. Last March, I helped coordinate a job training partnership between the center and 3 local companies, and I sat in on the first orientation session and watched 12 veterans walk into a room with a new set of options in front of them, and I thought, this is the version of service I'm good at right now. Quiet, specific, in a room with fluorescent lights, and the same 2 jokes from Edward every Thursday. Sargent still needs the yard. My father still calls every Sunday. My mother still makes peach cobbler. And she still thinks I don't eat enough. And she is correct on both counts. I hung a new framed print on the wall outside the Resource Center's main room last spring. It's a quote from a letter a Union soldier wrote home to his wife in 1864, something my father, the history teacher, had told me about years ago. The quote is about duty and love, and how they are not opposites, even when the world tries to convince you they are. I put it there because I walk past it twice a week, and because I needed a reminder that I could choose, every day, what kind of person I was going to be on the other side of what happened to me. And I needed other people to have that reminder too. If you're in a season where something you trusted has turned out to be something different than what it appeared, I'm not going to tell you it doesn't hurt. It does. I'm not going to tell you it resolves quickly, because it doesn't. What I will tell you is that the people who showed up for me during the hardest part of that season were the ones who reminded me, simply by being who they were, that trustworthy people exist. That loyalty is real. That integrity isn't a thing that belongs to a specific chapter of your life. It's something you practice, or you don't, every day, in ways large and small. Marcus could have deleted the screenshot. He didn't. I could have let what happened make me bitter. I'm choosing not to. That's not a conclusion. That's just where I am right now, and right now is enough.